Thank you, Joe Mac. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and let's just go into 7:02 p.m. now. So let's go ahead and start the Zoominar. I'm David Newsome, the president of HAL 5, and I would like to welcome everyone for attending the December 2020 talk. Tonight we have a special speaker, Andrew Chaikin. I did pronounce that right, Chaikin?
Yeah, you got it right.
Chaikin, okay, excellent, good. I wasn't sure.
Perfect, yeah.
And so you are a writer and a space historian. You've written one of the notable books you've written is a man upon the moon, and which was actually the basis for a HBO TV show. And you've also been doing a lot of teaching at NASA, and also a graduate from Brown University. So I guess with that, I guess that's kind of a basic spiel, and I guess you can also talk about a number of various other books you've written maybe later on as well. With that, I'd like to then hand over the form to you, and I'll just let you start talking now. So I'm going to put myself on the background.
Okay, David, thank you very much. And thanks for everybody for attending. It's nice to be able to do this. It's always fun for me to be able to talk about the Apollo missions. And, David mentioned that I've been teaching at NASA, and that's been kind of a new phase of my career, actually, since 2016. What I've done is, as a historian, I've gone back to Apollo, and I have put together a framework to talk about success and failure in spaceflight projects, with an emphasis on the mindset that the people bring to the work, the project teams, and the sort of thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, assumptions, the human behavior piece of success and failure. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about the experiences of the Apollo astronauts on their lunar missions, but I'm also going to be working in a little bit of the lessons learned flavor. And I think you'll find that interesting. And if there's anybody who's on the call tonight who is working on Artemis, maybe you can speak up at some point and give your thoughts about how the stuff that I'm going to be talking about relates to the plans to return humans to the moon in the latter part of this decade. So let me start out by talking, just a reminder about questions. The way that David and I talked about this, about doing questions tonight, is that you guys can just type your questions into the chat box. And what I will do is every so often I will stop in my slide narrative, and I'll see if there are any questions in the chat box, and we'll take care of those questions, and then I'll continue with the talk. So let me just start out by showing you some of the Apollo astronauts, the way they looked back in 1994 when my book, A Man on the Moon, was published. I took this picture at a gathering of Apollo astronauts at the Experimental Aircraft Association gathering in Oshkosh, Wisconsin in July of 1994. This was commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing. And in honor of that occasion, they brought together 15 Apollo astronauts. So by 1994, these guys were in their 60s, and it had been quite a number of years, obviously, since they had flown their lunar missions. But this is the way I remember them at the time that I was interviewing them. And so I'll just rattle off the names from right to left, going in chronological order of the missions. You've got Wally Schirra and Walt Cunningham from Apollo 7, and then Frank Borman, Bill Anders, and Jim Lovell from Apollo 8. Jim McDivitt in a green, looks like a green golf shirt kind of thing. Next to him in kind of pink shirt is Gene Cernan, and then Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Mike Collins, Pete Conrad, Dick Gordon, Stu Ruzza, Al Worden, and finally Charlie Duke. So, you know, when I got to them beginning in 1985, I was catching them, you know, in most cases 15, 16 years after they had gone to the moon, around that time frame. And yet, you know, obviously they had a lot of memories of the experience that were very interesting to me. That was the focus of my work on A Man on the Moon. I wanted to write the story of the missions through the eyes of the astronauts and answer the question what it was like to go to the moon. But I was also interested in, you know, the effect of that experience on the astronauts in the rest of their lives. So, you know, we talked about that also. And I did put some of that material into A Man on the Moon. I also did a follow-up book. My wife and I did a follow-up book in 2009 called Voices from the Moon, which has a lot of quotes from my conversations with them on all aspects of the moon experience, and as well the aftermath. So having given you that introduction, let me go back in time to what these guys were doing before they got into NASA and before they became astronauts, before they even thought about going to the moon. They were pilots. They all, you know, except for Jack Schmitt, who was the only professional scientist on the Apollo missions, on the lunar missions, all the rest had been test pilots or fighter pilots. And, you know, epitomized by Neil Armstrong here, who actually was a NASA pilot before he became an astronaut and actually flew to above 50 miles, I believe. Let's see, 200,000 feet. I guess that's not 50 miles. So I guess he would not have earned his astronaut wings, but got close in the X-15. And, you know, these guys were all motivated by their love of flight, their love of airplanes, wanting to go higher and faster. A lot of them, like Neil, were engineering test pilots who really loved the business of taking a brand new flying machine and finding out what it could do, exploring the envelope of that machine, and paving the way for the others who would fly it later. Of course, in the case of the X-15, that was a completely experimental aircraft, rocket plane. And of course, you know, there are just a handful of people who flew the X-15, even smaller number, of course, than the people who went to the moon. You know, Neil told me when I talked to him for the book that he, at the time he was a test pilot, you know, in the mid 50s into the early 60s, he would never have imagined when he started out as a test pilot in 1955, that time frame, that he would never imagine that he would even live to see people go into space in his lifetime. And of course, everything changed with Sputnik. And by the time NASA was ready to select the second group of astronauts, Neil had his sights on the astronaut program and was selected, as we all know. So with that little bit of background, let's talk a little bit about what they had to do to prepare for a lunar mission. You know, I'm sure that there's some overlap in what I'm going to tell you about here with what the astronauts for the Artemis missions are going to be doing and maybe are already doing now. So on the left, you see one of the Apollo astronauts flying the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, the LLTV, which was a specially built flying machine just for the explicit purpose of training astronauts to land on the moon. And it could simulate flying in 1/6 gravity. That was the key to the value of the LLTV. It was a very dangerous machine. It was almost on the verge of instability, but it was essential because there was no other way to get an actual flavor, a feeling for what it was like to maneuver in 1/6 G and have to maneuver over obstacles like craters and boulders and come down and land safely in the spot that you picked out. Of course, it did this with a jet engine that supported 5/6 of its weight, and the rest was supported by rockets. which were controlled by the pilot. And so, like I say, very dangerous machine. Neil had to eject from it, an earlier version of it, about a little more than a year before Apollo 11. And another couple of times, test pilots had to eject from it, NASA test pilots, but it was absolutely essential. I don't know whether there's any plan to have something like this for Artemis. Maybe it's not needed anymore because of the superb computerized flying controls that we have now. But back in those days, it was essential. In the middle, on the top, you see Pete Conrad and Alan Bean in the Lunar Module Fixed Space Simulator at the Cape. And they, this is the way that they went through all of the different procedures that they would have to do during an actual mission. And of course, this was the way that, they were able to test the astronauts' knowledge of the mission rules, things like that. That's a lot of what I call what-if thinking that NASA really strengthened for Apollo. It's one of the reasons we got to the moon, was the use of what-if thinking, to sit down way ahead of time and say, what do we do if A happens? What do we do if B happens and C happens? All those potential malfunctions, we've got to have procedures ready. On the right, you see the KC-135, Ed Mitchell in the front, Alan Shepard in the back, practicing pulling a wheeled tool cart called the Modular Equipment Transporter, or MET. And they're actually getting to experience 16G in the KC-135 by the pilot flying a parabolic arc. And so this was really good practice in a pressurized suit for getting a feeling for how you would actually move across the surface and conduct all kinds of other tasks. And finally, at the bottom, as the Apollo missions progressed, it became more and more important for the astronauts to become very skilled lunar field geologists. And so the fellow in the dark green shirt with the blue stripes is a Caltech geologist named Lee Silver. And he is taking the Apollo 16 prime and backup crews, John Young and Charlie Duke on the prime crew, and Ed Mitchell and Fred Hayes on the backup crew, through a training exercise in some desert location there. And so this is how they honed their skills as lunar field geologists, and being able to identify rock types, and just as important, the context for those rocks, so that if they picked up a sample, they would be able to provide some information that would help the geologists back on Earth to understand that sample and where it had come from and what had happened to it. I have a buddy that I actually went to college with named Jim Garvin at NASA Goddard. He's the chief scientist at NASA Goddard. And he said, I never met a rock that lied to me. And it's a great way to explain why it's so important to be able to pick up rocks on the moon and bring them home, so that we can read the stories that they have to tell us about the earliest history of the solar system. Okay, let's get into the moon experience itself. So the one thing about going to the moon that we have not done since Apollo is leaving Earth orbit. It's not the only thing, obviously, but since Apollo, nobody has been farther than a few hundred miles away from the Earth. And so, the astronauts who go to the moon on Artemis, the thing that they will experience is seeing the Earth as a planet. And that was just a breathtaking experience for the astronauts. Even these, engineering, left brain, steely-eyed missile men, test pilots, and fighter pilots were all impressed and occasionally expressed, significant emotion at seeing the Earth like this, the beauty of the Earth, the fact that it really was the Earth, the fact that you could look back and see, everything everybody you've ever known, every place you've ever been, and see it get smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point where after a couple of days, you know, it was no bigger than a golf ball at arm's length. And then by the time you get out to the moon, it's so small that you can cover it with your outstretched thumb. And so, you know, the Earth, Stu Ruzza from Apollo 14 told me that the Earth was the magnet of the flight, just kept drawing their attention. And of course, you know, it's home. And so you're also very aware that you're leaving home and you're putting your neck out on a very long limb. And one of the things that Stu said brought that across to him was not so much the visual aspect of seeing the Earth get small, but the delay in the radio signals. That by the time you get, you know, a few 100,000 miles out or so, you start to have a noticeable delay in the radio communication between the time you call the ground and the time they answer you. You know, it's not immediate. And of course, by the time you get to the moon, it's a second and a half each way. So, you know, the astronauts who go to the moon on Artemis will definitely have that feeling, and they'll be blown away by the beauty of the Earth and the dwindling size of the Earth. And I'm sure they'll get a lot of great pictures, just as good as these, if not better. This is a sequence from Apollo 15. And I should mention, on the left, you can see South America at the bottom of the Earth, and you can see West Africa peeking around from the Terminator. You know, when you see it like this, it's easy to understand what you're looking at. But Bill Anders, who was on Apollo 8, the first flight around the moon, said that when he first looked out the window at the Earth, he literally couldn't tell what he was looking at for a while, because it didn't, you know, it wasn't north up. It wasn't like the schoolroom globe. So keep that in mind as something that may happen to you. Okay, after a journey of about 70 hours or so, they fired their big service propulsion system engine on the mothership, the service module, went into orbit around the moon. Now they were in orbit around the moon, and they could look out the window and see this amazing, desolate landscape, ancient landscape covered with impact craters. And I love these two. These are from Apollo 15, because you can see the window frame. And in the one on the left, you can even see the hand of the astronaut who's taking the picture reflected on the window, and the lens of his camera. And the picture on the left was over the lunar near side, the side that faces the Earth. And that face of the moon is characterized much more by these smooth lava plains that we call seas. Apollo 11 and 12 landed on sites like that. On the right, you see the giant crater Tsiolkovsky. It's over 100 miles across, and it's on the far side of the moon. And it's got a very dark floor because of eruptions of lava within the crater. But around it, you see what most of the lunar far side looks like. It's this very beat up, kind of pummeled terrain, much brighter in color. And, you know, so very different experience going over the near side of the moon than the far side of the moon. Of course, the near side has highland areas as well, but they are very different. One of the things that Pete Conrad told me about orbiting the moon was that there was no doubt in his mind that the moon was much smaller than the Earth, because you could tell by the fact that you were going around it slower, so it had less gravity. And also you could see the smaller size. It was almost like you could, if you craned your neck, you could see over a little further around the corner. Of course, he couldn't, but he definitely had that sense of orbiting a smaller body. And of course, the moon is only a quarter the size of the Earth. The other thing that they all noticed, and Alan Bean talked about this, that the moon looked really different depending on where you were relative to the sun. So when you first come over the day-night dividing line, the so-called terminator, everything is very rugged looking. It looks like, you know, my God, you'd never want to land there. But then, after you get away from that, things start to look smoother. And it's just simply the fact that the shadows are diminishing. So the angle of illumination on the moon really affects how it appears visually. And places that had seemed very, very rugged for even the Apollo 11 landing site, when they first went over it, they thought, wow, we don't want to land there because it looked so rugged in the long shadows of the lunar morning. But the next day, when they were actually getting ready to land, it looked much less forbidding. Okay, like I say, the Earth was the magnet of the flight, and nothing was more spectacular to the astronauts than seeing the Earth rising beyond the lunar horizon in orbit around the moon. The phenomenon called Earthrise, which was first seen from Apollo 8, but every crew that orbited the moon saw it and photographed it. This is one from Apollo 17. And, Bill Anders was the first guy to photograph it on Apollo 8. And he said that he told me that when he saw the Earth, it, like I say, it's so small that you can cover it with your outstretched thumb if you did that. I don't know if anybody actually did that. I think Jim Lovell said he did, but, the point is it's really small, and that's where you have to get back to. So Bill told me that, he had two simultaneous thoughts when he saw the Earth rise. One was, my God, that's the prettiest thing I've ever seen. And the other one was, gee, I hope we get back there. I hope we hit that thing, that the engine works to get us out of lunar orbit, and that then the targeting is good enough that we actually do get back safely. And the reentry, the very demanding reentry through a very narrow cone of safety, just 2 degrees wide, the cone of safety of the trajectory that you have to have getting back safely into the Earth's atmosphere. So the Earthrise is definitely going to be one of the standout experiences for anybody who goes to the moon. Now, the landing was the toughest part of the whole mission. And when they did it on Apollo 11, of course, when Neil and Buzz did it on Apollo 11, nobody had ever done it before. And so it was a real, there was a lot of unknowns that needed to be considered, and they couldn't account for everything. It turned out that there was a very obscure quirk in the power supply to the lander's computer, the LEMS computer, that caused those famous alarms that we all know about, the 1201 and 1202 alarms. Fortunately, thanks to some very good what-if thinking before the mission, Steve Bales in Mission Control had his backroom guy, Jack Garman, who was prepared with a crib sheet of all the potential alarms, and he was able to tell the crew that it's okay, you can keep going, we'll lighten the computer's workload. So that was, heart-stopping moment number one on that landing. Number two was when Neil got a chance to look out the window after the alarms were finally all squared away. He saw that the computer was taking them into a giant crater the size of a football stadium with gigantic boulders around it, boulders the size of cars. And so he had to take over semi-manual control and fly past the boulder field and look for a safe spot. Funny thing was, I knew that from reading the debriefing that Neil had actually given some thought to trying to land short of the boulders and, before the boulder field, because he knew how much that would please the scientists back on Earth if he and Buzz could get a sample of lunar bedrock. And I said to him, I got to tell you that it just amazes me that in the heat of the moment, you actually were thinking about trying to land there. And he kind of chuckled and he said, yeah, I didn't have quite that much courage. So that was surprise number two. The final surprise was after he found a good place to land and started his vertical descent, beginning at around 75 feet or so, as he came down vertically, the descent rocket, the plume of the descent rocket was disturbing the lunar dust on the surface and blowing it out radially in all directions. And what you see here is a still from an animation done by John Knoll, who is a special effects guru in Hollywood. He's the chief technical guy at Industrial Light and Magic that does all the Star Wars movies and all the other, Pirates of the Caribbean. A lot of that stuff is John's. Well, he's also an Apollo geek too. So he did this really fabulous animation of the Apollo 11 landing. And you're looking down on the lunar module as it's just, a few feet above the moon. And the problem was that Neil had to look through that blowing dust, which was very confusing to his perception of motion. He needed to be able to arrest any sideways movement. And in particular, he did not want to be going backwards because he didn't want to end up with his rear foot pad in a crater or on a boulder. And he also didn't want to have a lot of sideways velocity because he didn't want to break off a landing leg, obviously. So he found that he could look at rocks that were sticking up above the blowing dust and use them as references. And that's how he was able to guide himself all the way down as the fuel supply was dwindling and dwindling and dwindling. But this was a surprise because nobody had ever conducted a piloted rocket landing on another world without an atmosphere. And, on Earth, we know dust just billows up. And there are a lot of people, even at NASA, who have made that mistake in recent years, talking about, oh, well, the dust will billow up. And that happened once when Neil was in the room and he just quietly said, it doesn't billow. Okay, let me see what's in the chat room. You may touch on this, but Apollo 11, did the astronauts really bust a switch for a circuit breaker needed to be closed? Yes, this is true. The circuit breaker was for the ascent engine that got them off the moon. And they did use a felt tip pen to push it back in. It broke off when they were getting ready to go outside and they were in their pressurized suits and the backpacks, and it's a very small cabin. And they didn't realize they had bumped into it. Buzz came in and he said it was when they were having their sleep period that night after the moonwalk, and he was lying on the floor and he saw this little piece of plastic amid the moon dust on the floor and realized that it had come off the panel. Now, it turns out they would have had other ways to work around firing that engine if they hadn't been able to do that. So it wasn't as dire as it may seem. Okay, let's see, another one. Skin of the lunar module so thin they could have punched their hand through it. Not their hand, but indeed a screwdriver. In fact, that happened more than once. Technicians were working on the lunar module cabin and a screwdriver slipped and it went through the metal wall of the crew cabin and they just patched it up before flight. So yeah, it was that thin. Okay. Not sure this is a question to be addressed, but why are the mare seemingly on the near side but not on the far side? So that has to do with the fact that the moon's crust is thinner on the near side than the far side. The whole moon is kind of off center in that way, and I used to know the reason for that. It's been a while since I looked at that paper, but that's the reason. It's easier when a big asteroid impact slams into the lunar crust and cracks the crust, and those cracks propagate down into the moon. It's easier for molten rock, pockets of magma back then to reach the surface on the near side than it was on the far side. And so that's why you have these big plains of frozen lava. Let's see. How small is the Earth from the moon? It's 4 times, the moon is 1/4 the size of the Earth, and the moon from the Earth is 1/2 a degree, which is like, for me, it's my little the fingernail on my pinky, if I stick that out at arm's length, it covers the full moon. Well, from the moon, the Earth is 4 times that size. Now, I asked Pete Conrad, did you notice the bigger size of the Earth? And he said, no, you don't notice it. In his words, he said, the sky is too big. You're looking into this dome of blackness. And in the places where they landed, most of the places where they landed, the Earth was pretty high up in the sky. And at least Pete Conrad did not notice the difference in size. It would be interesting to ask Jack Schmitt if he did notice. Okay, and then finally, how long did the astronauts who landed on the moon remain in a standing position? Well, keep in mind, they were only standing while they were flying the lunar module. And during that time, they were either in 0G as they were getting ready to do the final descent, or they were in 16G when they were doing the actual powered descent to the moon. So it was not a lot of force that was holding them down onto the cabin floor. So they used restraints. They used cables that hooked onto the sides of their suits that held them down on the floor. Okay, let me go back to the slides. And why don't we move along here? So this is, one of countless pictures that were taken from the surface that show what that is like. Magnificent desolation is what Buzz Aldrin called it on Apollo 11. This is a picture that Alan Shepard took on 14 with just a beautiful portrait of the lunar module. And the thing that you notice right away is the black sky. Blacker than any black you've ever seen is the way they described it. And yet the surface itself is illuminated by this brilliant unfiltered sunlight of space. And it looked quite bright to them. And that's something that, whenever I see representations of the moon in movies, I'm always a little frustrated when I see them portray it as someplace that looks, dark and like it's off in some netherworld somewhere. It's not. It's like I say, it's this brilliantly illuminated landscape. And against that landscape, the gold foil of the lunar module was just vivid color. The surface itself ranged from kind of a grayish tan to a kind of an ashen gray to a kind of a whitish gray, depending on where you were looking relative to the sun. So looking directly away from the sun was actually kind of chalky white. And that's where it was brightest, because it turns out the microscopic structure of the soil is such that it's got all these little, what they call fairy castles of dust, and they all cast shadows. But if you're looking directly away from the sun, the shadows are hidden. And so you just get this back reflection from the dust itself. If you look off to one side of that down sun point, it's kind of a tannish gray. If you look 90 degrees to the sun, it's more of an ashen gray. And of course, if you look up into the sun, you can't see much because it's so brilliantly illuminated. But Dave Scott, I talked to Dave Scott about this, and he said, this is a new thing for the human mind to process, is a black sky in the daytime. We've all seen black sky at night. That's our only experience of a black sky. But you go to the moon and you're in the middle of the brilliant daylight. And Dave Scott felt that there was something about the newness of that kind of the brain translated into the elation of being on the moon. They did feel excited to be there. Even Pete Conrad, I think, who, was very, all business about everything he did as an astronaut. He was also a guy who liked to have fun. And I'm sure many of you remember that he was humming and cackling, and he was just having a great time. And some of that had to be the excitement of just being there. And in the case of the later missions, being there with a real purpose to do some exploring. Now, as we look at the moon on the more micro scale, this of course is the famous picture of Buzz Aldrin's boot with his imprint in the dust that he's just made, and he's holding his boot over the imprint so that you have a reference in the photo, and you can see how fine-grained that dust is. It's extremely fine powder. And of course, this has to do with the fact that the moon has no atmosphere. And so over billions and billions of years, the micrometeorites from space just come slamming down onto the moon, and they grind that dust into powder. So the whole moon is covered with a layer of this very fine powdery dust. And it sticks to everything. You can see Buzz's boot there. Fascinating stuff. It holds the imprint of the boot, as you can see, very, very sharply. It also holds a pretty steep slope, especially when it's compacted. So, it was a kind of part of the amazement was to look down at this very powdery surface. And of course, in 1/6 gravity, every time they put their foot down, they had a kind of an umbrella-shaped ring of dust fly away from their boot. That's what they described. And if you think about it, again, no atmosphere, but each little dust particle is like a ballistic projectile, like a cannonball. So when you put your foot down on the surface, you're going to have all these little dust particles going away in ballistic trajectories. And I want to just go back to the moment after the Apollo 11 landing, because it's one of my favorite stories that Neil talked about. He said that, they had all this blowing dust in the last moments of the landing, in the last, minute or 2 minutes of the landing. And he's fighting his way down. Finally, they get down on the surface, and he'd meant to shut the engine down before they actually hit the surface so that they would land at a relatively low velocity and not, he meant to land with a little bit more velocity so that he would cause the honeycomb structure inside the legs to compress a little bit and bring the bottom of the ladder a little closer to the surface. But he forgot all about that because he was so busy concentrating on flying. He gets down to the surface, hits the shutdown button on the engine, and looks out the window. And he said he could see this radial pattern of dust suddenly stop and fly all the way out to the horizon. These dust particles that had been continuous streaks before this, up to now, the moment he shut down the engine, they just flew all the way out to the horizon, and then there was utter stillness. And it was just one of the most amazing things he'd ever seen. And my own theory is that accounts for the slight pause before he says, "Houston, Tranquility Base, here, the Eagle has landed." In 1/6 gravity, that was part of the joy of being on the moon. They had trained in these really heavy suits, 180 pounds worth of gear. And on the moon, of course, it's just 30 pounds of gear because it's 1/6. So, if you weigh 180 pounds and your suit weighs 180 pounds, that's 360 pounds, but on the moon, it's only 60 pounds. So as a result, suddenly you have this amazing freedom of movement, okay? And I've only gotten to experience lunar gravity one time. It was on my last flight on the KC-135. I flew it a number of times. And the last time I flew back in '99, we got to do one lunar parabola and one Martian parabola. I always thought walking on the moon would feel like walking on a trampoline, you know, but in fact, that's what Mars gravity feels like. That's 38% of Earth. Moon gravity, lunar gravity, feels almost like being weightless. It's like somebody had a dimmer switch and they just turned the dimmer switch just enough to bring you down onto the surface. So here you see a picture that Pete Conrad took, and he was taking a panoramic view of the surface, but he caught Al Bean running along, and you can see that he's almost on tiptoes. And Alan talked to me quite a bit about the sensation of running on the moon. And he said, you know, you'd go, just like I was just talking about the dust going in a ballistic arc. Well, you do that too. You know, you push off with one foot and you kind of sail up over this arc and you come back down. And, you know, he said you had to be careful because you didn't want to come down in a crater or on a rock and you know, send yourself flying off in some direction. And so he was always watching to see where he was going to hit, but he was, at the same time, he was loving the experience. The thing he noticed was that he was airborne long enough for his calf muscles to relax. And he said it was almost like he would never get tired. So that was kind of cool. Okay, let's see what we have in the chat room. No stars on the moon because the surface is so bright. They're there, but you just can't see them unless you're standing in the shadow of the lunar module and you let your eyes dark adapt. They did capture the planet Venus in some of the surface photography on Apollo 16. Go on the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal and you'll find that. And let's see. Like gunpowder. Yeah, gunpowder actually, the consistency of lunar dust is like powdered cement or powdered, you know, powdered charcoal, powdered cement, that kind of grain size. Gunpowder is interesting because it smelled like gunpowder. When they got back in the LEM, took off their helmets, and repressure. Well, they repressurize first, of course, then they take off their helmets. They could smell a smell that reminded them of gunpowder, a cap that had just been fired, or a cannon even. And Jack Schmidt, being a geologist, has theorized that it has to do with, you know, elements in the lunar dust that has never been exposed to oxygen before. And as soon as it's exposed to oxygen, it reacts and creates that smell. Okay, navigating on the moon. That was a problem for the guys on the early landings. I mean, Neil and Buzz never had a problem because they didn't go anywhere. They just, Neil ran back to a 80-foot diameter crater, you know, and was only gone for about a couple of minutes. He took some pictures of the crater and then ran back while Buzz was getting a core sample. But on 12, they went, you know, they went quite a ways on foot. And on 14, they went even further. And on 14, they were trying to find the edge of a big crater, you know, basically a football field sized crater called Cone Crater, which was at the top of a hill. And so they had to climb up a hill on foot, dragging that two-wheeled equipment cart. They got pretty tired out doing it, but they also had a real problem figuring out where they were, and they never did find the rim of the crater to look into. And the problem was that, you know, number one, the photographs were the best we had at the time, but they didn't show things small enough to be able to really readily identify them on the surface. Not only that, but, you know, this is something Alan Bean told me. When you look at a crater on the map, it's, you know, it's a circle. You can tell one crater from another. When you're on the ground, though, they're all foreshortened, and you can't figure out which crater is which. So, you know, it was even worse on Apollo 14, because as they went up the side of Cone Crater, you know, it was like ridges. And Ed Ed Mitchell, who you see in the picture here, Alan Shepard's panorama, there's Ed Mitchell in the middle. Ed said to me that it was like you were going up and down over sand dunes. And they kept thinking that as they got to the top of each dune, they weren't really dunes, but they kind of had that topography. He kept thinking as we get to the top of each new ridge, they'd see the crater, and they never did. Well, I want to draw your attention to the right-hand edge of the photo where you see some boulders, and some of them are fairly light colored. Those boulders are only a few dozen yards from the rim of the crater. So we're actually looking past the rim and onto the plains beyond, or the highlands beyond, I should say. So they actually went to those boulders and they still didn't know that they were within a relatively short walk of the rim. One of the geologists said when they came back, you weren't lost, but you didn't know it. So let's see. Navigation trouble was eliminated on the rover missions, which had a navigating system as part of the vehicle. So not only that, but they were landing in places where there were mountains. And so they always had a reference on the horizon for which way they were heading. And so the navigation was not a problem on those rover missions. This is a still from a 16 millimeter movie that Charlie Duke took while John Young was carrying out a test objective called the Grand Prix, which was to have Charlie document on movie film the way the rover behaved in 1/6 gravity as it was being driven across the surface. And you can see here that the right front wheel is completely off the ground. I mean, in 1/6 gravity, even though that rover weighs hundreds of pounds, I mean, Ron Creel can tell us how much a fully loaded rover and one or two astronauts weighs, but in 1/6 gravity, this thing is just bouncing up and down like a rowboat on a choppy sea, and only in slow motion compared to that. And the other thing I want you to notice is the plumes of dust that are being kicked up by the wheels, and you can see them to the right of the rover. And anybody who thinks we didn't go to the moon, well, I've come to believe there's nothing you can really do to change the minds of a conspiracy theorist. But these movies are not, you could not fake this. We didn't have this, certainly didn't have the technology during Apollo to fake the behavior of the dust in a vacuum in 1/6G that's recorded in these movies. And of course, the rover took them to fabulous, fabulous places. This is Dave Scott on Apollo 15 with a backdrop of the lunar Apennine Mountains. And in the background, the biggest mountain is a mountain called Hadley Delta, 11,000 feet high. Of course, you know, as Dave told me, you know, you couldn't really tell how high they were because you had nothing to compare them to. No buildings, no trees, no billboards, you know. So he said, you know, how high is up and how big is big? You just can't tell when you're there. And of course, that's another thing about navigating that actually did fool even the rover guys, was the fact that you don't have any atmospheric haze to tell you distance from where you want to go. So like on Apollo 16, when they went to the big boulder, they thought they were a lot closer to it than they really were. But so here is Dave, you know, next to a giant canyon called Hadley Rill with these beautiful mountains. And, you know, Dave is one of the guys who talks about the beauty of the moon, you know, a test pilot to his core, but he really talks about the fact that the beauty of the moon is one of the things that you just can't anticipate until you're there. The photographs obviously don't do it justice. So, you know, I'm really looking forward to hearing what the Artemis guys have to say. And I'm hoping that we get some good high def TV back from the landings also, so that maybe we can get a little more of a sense of what it's like. Now, of course, they were there to be geologists. And here is Dave up on the side of Hadley Delta right? During the second of the 3 moonwalks that they did on Apollo 15. And you can see he's on a pretty steep slope, and it's covered with this fine layer of dust. And it was really tough going. It was a lot of work in a pressurized suit on foot to walk up one of these dust covered slopes. You know, it was like trying to walk up a sand dune. And so, you know, that's something to think about when people go back to the moon, is going to be the challenge of operating on these slopes in a pressurized suit. But it's a beautiful place. I mean, my God, imagine standing there and being able to look out. And this is what it does look like from the side of Hadley Delta. Looking back down onto the plains, you can see the rover tracks at the bottom of the big picture. And notice the little white square. The white square shows the inset on the right. The big picture was taken with an 80mm lens. The one on the right, the inset, was taken with the 500mm lens. Dave Scott took the telephoto shot, and he told me it's his favorite picture because it shows the lunar module Falcon, which is 3.5 miles away. I mean, if the rover broke down at this point, they'd have to walk back. And yet they were not apprehensive. They were just excited to be there. Everything was working great. That's a big piece of the Apollo story, is how much confidence the astronauts had in all the work that had been done by so many thousands upon thousands of people to make these things successful and to look out for their safety. And that's absolutely paramount in the story of Apollo, is how they did that. That's what I teach in my success and failure course. But so this is Dave's favorite picture. As lunar field geologists, you know, they had to really be surrogates for the scientists back on Earth. The scientists back on Earth trained them, took them on field trips and so on. But, you know, there's only so much that, you can do. Once you get there, you're going to have to, you know, use your own eyes, your own brain to see what it is you're finding and report it back and pick up the samples that'll tell the story. And on Apollo 16, which is what you see here, John Young and Charlie Duke are standing next to a huge crater. I think it's the biggest crater that anybody actually went up to on the moon, North Ray Crater. And I put this together from television frames from the rover. And, you know, off to the right is a boulder the size of a building that they called House Rock that they went to as well. Those rocks were not what the scientists had told them to expect. The scientists told them they should expect volcanic rocks. What they found instead were rocks produced by the pressure and heat of an asteroid impact, breccias, which are made of fragments of rocks welded together by the force of the impact. So John and Charlie were very, very sharp and very competent lunar field geologists. And they knew that their job was to find what was there, not what they were told to expect. And they did a great job. All that exploring carries with it a lot of fatigue. Every movement of that suit is work, and especially the gloves. Now, I know there's been a lot of work on gloves since Apollo, but I don't know if they have really significantly reduced the strain that you will experience doing things like closing up a sample bag, like you see here, John Young doing. He's rolling up the top of a bag of lunar dust. And John told me that, you know, you have to learn to work with your hands when your hands don't work anymore. And on the last 3 missions, particularly, one of the problems they had was they adjusted the gloves, particularly on 15. I don't know if they had as much of a problem on 16 and 17. I think they did, actually. Yeah, no, they did. The tips of the gloves, when they would bring their arms in, like John's doing right here, their fingertips would pound against the tips of the glove, and it actually broke blood vessels under the skin in some cases. And it really hurt. It really wore out their hands, wore out their arms. They found, Jack Schmidt told me that after, a night's rest, they felt renewed, that he felt that the blood circulation was improved in 1,6-G and it cleansed the muscles of lactic acid. But still, the damage to the fingertips was sometimes very painful. So, that's one of the things you got to think about when guys are on the surface doing EVAs all the time, that they're going to be paying a price in that sense. Now, guys who do EVAs on the ISS, I don't know if they're doing work that's quite that taxing in terms of the fingertips, but maybe I'm wrong about that, but it'll be interesting to see how they deal with that. And then here's a shot that just shows you how dirty you get after you've been on the moon for 3 days, working 7 hours a day in that very, very fine grained dust that sticks to everything. And of course, it's sharp edged. It's got sharp corners because it's all created from impacts. So, they all talked about it wearing things out. It scratched the visor. It wore down the rubber coating on their geology hammer. And they weren't there long enough for it to really cause a problem with a suit or a zipper or anything like that. But they also worked very hard greasing the zippers and making sure. But John Young told me when people go back to the moon, the thing they better worry about is the dust. And finally, you get back in the lander, you can see Gene Cernan, how dirty he is, how dirty his suit is, and you can see the surface out the right-hand window. Now you've got to try and get some sleep, but you're so jacked up, you're so excited by being on the moon that it's almost hard to go to sleep. At least that's what Gene said. I don't know if they'll really have a problem with that, but the Apollo guys did talk about sleeping on the moon, and some of them had an easier time than others. It really helped that they could take off their suit on the rover missions. The suit was redesigned so that they could get out of the suit while they were in the LEM, just put out some hammocks, very rudimentary beta cloth hammocks, and they slept very well in those. Okay, let's see who's in the chat room. Somebody has helpfully put on the URL for the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal. And yes, Greg Allison, good comment. They did use a map to fix a broken fender on one mission, and duct tape, of course, which is essential in any operation, duct tape is. Geologist who provided that map, Jan Cannon is not a name I remember. I don't know. Those were the photo maps they had brought with them so they could navigate. Do they have enough air support to walk back from the rover? So that's an interesting question. They had what was called the walk back limit, okay? And the walk back limit was constructed in such a way that Mission Control would never let them get far enough away from the LEM that they didn't have enough oxygen to walk back if the rover broke down. Now, what happens if one of the backpack fails? Well, they also had a pair of hoses that would let one astronaut share oxygen with the other and then get on the rover and drive back. Aha, but you may ask, what happens if you have a backpack failure and a rover failure? Well, that is a bad day. That is something you might not get two guys safely back to the LEM. But they assumed that that was so unlikely that they didn't need to have that as a constraint on how far they went. Okay, how do they know if it's day or night? Well, the sun was out during the lunar day. They could see the sun very clearly. Nobody has been on the moon when it's nighttime. That'll be an interesting experience once people do that to see what that's like. question about the lunar dust, breathing it in. He said he had an attack of hay fever when they would get back in the LEM. He would start sneezing. I don't know about wheezing, but he did say he had like a hay fever attack where he would start sneezing. I've asked about the health hazards of lunar regolith. I'm not sure what the answers are, and I don't know what the plans are to protect the Artemis guys from lunar dust. Maybe if is anybody on the call working on this, maybe you want to unmute and speak up. If anybody's on Artemis, please feel free to unmute and just chime in.
This is David. I don't know if you can hear me. I have to unmute them, but if anyone wants to, like, I think there's a way to, like, to raise your hand in the chat box. Let me see how this works. I can allow people to talk if they just raise their hand. If anyone wants to chime in.
That's good.
Wait. Is Ron Krill? Okay, it looks like Ron Krill's raising his hand, and then Bill's going to raise his hand. Okay, let me go with Ron first. Let's see. Okay, Ron, you can talk. You just have to unmute your phone.
Yes, there I am. I will say that I've been trying to counsel people that the real answer for me is to leave the suits outside the habitat, to have an airlock or some method that you can leave that dust covered suit outside and keep that dust out.
Very good call, Ron. Is that a problem though in any way for the servicing of the suits if you're on the moon for an extended period?
Not really. I mean, we're smart enough to do that. It's an unknown as to the ultimate hazard to the lungs of having those sharp particles getting into the lungs.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
I'm gonna allow Bill to talk now, and then Tim Weaver right after that. Hey, Bill, you're on the line now.
Oh, okay. Well, great talk. I enjoyed seeing it. It actually gives us a perspective for those of us who are on the Artemis program.
Are you on Artemis, Bill?
Yeah, well, not as an astronaut, but...
No, but I mean, what are you working on?
I work with Greg Allison out there on the safety and mission assurance for the SLS core stage.
Cool.
But things like the fact that the lunar dust blasts out radially and obscures everything is really something that we can learn from, particularly the Human Lander group. So you've given some perspectives and some photographs that I've never seen that makes you feel like you were actually there.
Well, Bill, let me just say, I've said this before, I don't have any contacts in the Human Lander group, but I would be happy to give a talk to them based on my Apollo lessons course, give a summary kind of talk to the folks in the Human Lander group. They can contact me through my website, andrewchaikin.com.
Okay. We always have, there was a, what's the name of that group? Greg, do you remember the name of the, you can post it on the chat. Every 3 months, we have a big talk by industry and other people that come in that talk about various aspects of the space program, and that would be a perfect venue for this. I'll see if I can put you in touch with the person that organizes that. They've been doing them virtually, of course, but sure. Can you post your email in the chat and I'll write it down?
Let me do that. Let me do that right now. And by the way, I do still have a few more slides to show.
Okay, good.
Greg, you can talk now, Greg.
Yeah, I don't remember the name of the person in charge of that, Bill, but Andrew, we mostly at Marshall are working on the Artemis launch vehicle, the Space Launch System, but there is a group here in town with Dynetics that are quite involved in the lander itself, and there are a couple of Dynetics people in HAL 5, such as our Vice President, David Hewitt. So I'm
great.
I suppose he's working that. So they're quite involved in that. That Dynetics group, a core of their space group came from our Halo project that we started in HAL 5 originally. We spun off a company called HARC, and then Tim Pickens went off and started Orion Propulsion from that and sold it to Dynetics.
Well, I'd be happy to talk to Dynetics as well.
Yeah, so that might work, or people out. Or then again, like Bill says, we do have the speeches at Marshall, so I just don't remember the name of the person put them out, but I'll keep an eye out. You gave a very, very excellent presentation. I really appreciate it. It's been a long time since I've seen you. I used to see you a lot at the ISDCs years ago.
Oh, not ISDC. I don't think I've ever been to ISDC.
I've been Space Frontier Foundation meetings then.
Well, I did go to one of those quite a few years back. So yeah.
I remember seeing you somewhere. I remember somewhere along the line there.
Well, thank you, Greg. And like I say, I do have a few more slides to do. So why don't I, David, I think, did you have one more person, David?
Yeah, Tim Weaver. You know, I guess we'll just let Tim. We'll just let Tim Weaver talk. Tim's part of the HAL 5 executive committee as well. And we'll just, hey Tim, you've got a few comments to make. We go ahead right now.
Yeah, I left a question to Q&A. Here's the question I was asking. Now, you mentioned that the terrain looks rugged and it's not, right?
No. What I mentioned was the degree, the appearance of the terrain changed dramatically with the sun angle, and that with a higher sun angle, I probably didn't say it quite right. The higher the sun angle, the less rugged it looks because the shadows are less. And the shadows are the only way you can really differentiate between highs and lows easily from orbit anyway. But, you know, there are certainly plenty of rugged places on the moon that don't look all that rugged in the orbital photos because they're taken at high sun. That the only point I was making was the visual appearance from orbit of the terrain roughness depends highly on the sun angle.
But all right, my question is though, does that have to do with the moon not having an atmosphere and the light, rather than being scattered and more evenly illuminating the moon, is the only illumination is from direct sunlight?
Yeah, and the other thing is, I mean, that's right. There's no atmosphere scattering light around, but also think about the fact that, you know, you're a lot closer to the surface of the moon in orbit. You're 69 statute miles above the surface in lunar orbit, and in Earth orbit, you're, you know, minimum of 100 and some odd miles, and you know, you're looking at surfaces that have in general, much less surface roughness on the Earth. On the moon, you've got these gigantic impact craters that create a lot of relief, a lot of up and down in the topography. And, you know, that's going to create an impression of roughness that you wouldn't get on that scale. You don't have gigantic holes in the ground, you know, tens of miles across on the Earth. So at least not, you know, if they're there, you don't really, they've been worn down by so much geologic activity that they don't have that kind of relief to them. They're just basically, you know, ghosts of what they once were. But orbiting the moon is so different because of the nature of the terrain, as well as the fact that, you know, like you said, there's no atmosphere.
All right, well, thank you.
Sure. Okay, let me press on and finish out my slide deck here. Let's talk a little bit about the experience of the guys who stayed behind in lunar orbit, the command module pilots. And I guess I confess that I don't know the Artemis mission architecture well enough to know, well, I know we're not going to have anybody in low lunar orbit. So I guess that answers my question right there. So on Apollo, 2 guys went down and explored the surface, and the 3rd guy stayed in orbit. And here you see Ken Mattingly on the left in the command module, and on the right, the rising Earth over the lunar far side. And by the way, here's a good example of, if you look at the moonscape here, you can kind of tell it's probably a pretty rough place. It looks like it's got a lot of up and down, but it's not as dramatic because you don't have the shadows. It's at noontime, high sun illumination. But so I talked to Ken Mattingly about the experience of orbiting the moon alone. And he surprised me because he said, look, he said, I can't imagine, you know, I've never walked on the moon, so I can't be sure about this. But he said, I can't imagine that bouncing around on the surface of the moon is more thrilling than orbiting the moon, than orbiting the moon by yourself. He said, it is just an amazing experience to be in this little spaceship, dead quiet, just the cabin fans are going, and you're going over this unreal landscape and you're drifting over it without a sound. And he just said it was absolutely amazing. And particularly going over some of the areas when they were not illuminated by the sun, but the Earth was still in the sky, then you have what's called Earthshine. And that is, if you ever look up at a crescent moon here on Earth and you see the rest of the moon illuminated in a kind of dim bluish gray color, that is Earthshine. That is light reflecting from the Earth back onto the moon. And when you're in orbit and you fly over the Earthshine part of the moon, the Earth-lit part of the moon, he said it looks like a snowfield, a snowscape that's illuminated by a full moon, only the Earth is much brighter. And you can see an amazing amount of detail even in Earthshine. This is an example of some of the exploring that you can do from orbit. Ken Mattingly took this picture of a crater that's almost 80 miles in diameter on the lunar far side called King Crater, with a very strange kind of fork-shaped central peak there, and just an extraordinary amount of detail that you can see, especially if you were to zoom into this. And of course, Ken, the command module pilots, like Mattingly, had been trained by geologists to understand what they were looking at and to put context on it, and to understand that they're looking at the results of a titanic impact event, which, you know, blasted out amazing amounts of the lunar crust and then, you know, left this cavity with terraced walls that are formed by collapse. And the uplift in the center is what forms those central peaks. And then the floor is covered with molten rock that went up into the sky when the impact happened and then rained back down into the crater. Within a time scale of a few minutes, you can form a crater that's 80 miles in diameter. And then the floor is covered with a lake of lava that cools into what you see here. So, you know, Ken Mattingly was orbiting the moon by himself and taking in all of this incredible geology, and just, it's reminding me of a quote that he told me where he said every time he'd look out the window, he'd see something that was so amazing that he was afraid it was going to wipe out the memory of what he'd seen before, you know, and he felt this sense of despair, but still, you know, that's how amazing this is. Finally, the solo orbital experience, probably the most otherworldly aspect of that was flying over the night side of the moon, where you don't have the sun or the Earth in the sky. And then, you know, once you get dark adapted and you have all the lights in the cabin out, you can just see a gazillion stars. And, you know, they all talked about it as more stars than you could ever see on the clearest night on Earth. And here you see a photograph that Ron Evans took on Apollo 17 with high-speed black and white film. And on the lower left, you see the lunar horizon, you see the silhouette of a crater. And beyond that is the zodiacal light, dust particles that are in the plane of the solar system that are left there by comets. And that is glowing in sunlight. The sun is about to rise. And above that, you see in this time exposure, you see stars streaking through the sky in the time exposure. And I always think when I see this picture of Al Worden on Apollo 15, who told me that you're there and you look out and you see all those stars and you just think, my God, there are just so many stars that there's gotta be civilizations out there. You know, you just can't imagine that there couldn't be. If you see that many stars, there are just so many stars. Okay, back on the surface, the guys on the surface had to get off the surface. And so there's the moment of truth with lighting the ascent engine and blasting off the moon. This is a still from the 16mm movie from Apollo 14. And you can see the blast of the ascent engine blowing some of that mylar or Kapton actually off of the descent stage and blowing the American flag, and they are bidding goodbye to the moon. Now, you know, that was a nail biter for everybody. As much confidence as they had, they still, you know, that's, as Stu Roosa said, every time you fire an engine, it's sweaty palms time. Well, especially so for a burn like this. And of course, the burn to get you out of lunar orbit was like that as well. Here they are in lunar orbit in the lunar module ascent stage. Gene Cernan, you could see him in the window there, flying the ascent stage back to a link up with the command module. And Gene said he was so happy to be back in that command module and just be able to take off that dirty suit and wet a washcloth and wash his face and feel like a new man and feel like they were home, even though they were still in lunar orbit and they knew they still had their necks very far out on a limb. You know, being back in the mothership did feel like home. And here is the moment of departure, looking back at the moon on Apollo 16 with a high-powered camera. And, you know, this was one of the only times that they had a sensation of speed, because as you leave the moon, you can see it get smaller as you watch. You actually notice the moon getting smaller and smaller as you climb away from it. Here's a shot from Apollo 17. This only happened on the last 3 missions. The command module pilot got to do an EVA about halfway back, like 180,000 miles from the Earth or so. So I guess that's more like a third of the way back. But anyway, very science fiction experience to be hanging on the side of the service module and see the moon as a ball off in one direction and the Earth as a ball off in the other direction. And everywhere else except for where the sun was just utter blackness. And Mattingly actually said it was a little scary. He said he looked into that blackness and he said he gripped the handrail so tight that if it hadn't been for the glove, he would have left fingerprints. Now, I can't imagine whether this is going to happen on Artemis. I think not. On Apollo, it happened because they needed to retrieve scientific film that was stored in the side of the service module. But I'll tell you, they ought to think up a reason to have to do it, because it sounds like an amazing experience. And then back on Earth, what an experience to be back on the home planet, to open the hatch and smell sea air and feel the wind on your face, particularly after the first 3 landings and they no longer had the quarantine. You can just see how good it felt to be back on Earth. And I'm going to close with this slide here of the giants, some of the giants of Apollo who made it possible for us to send humans to the moon and carry that out. On the left, you see Bob Gilruth, who created the culture at JSC, the Manned Spacecraft Center then, that involved, you know, so much about trusting the people that they hired. I've written a lot about these guys. Obviously, Von Braun was the same kind of leader, just inspired tremendous respect and admiration. Gilruth really mentored people like Chris Kraft, who you see in the middle there, who created Mission Control and all of the things that they did to the what if thinking that I talked about earlier, and so many other things that they did to prepare to be ready for things that might go wrong. On the right, you see George Low, who was the Apollo spacecraft program manager after the fire. and was so important in recovering from that tragedy. And behind Kraft, standing right behind Kraft, you see Sam Phillips, General Sam Phillips. And he's really one of the great lesser known heroes of Apollo, because he was brought in by NASA headquarters in 1963 to be the Apollo program director. And he brought practices of program management, systems management, I should say, systems engineering, systems management, things like configuration control that are so fundamental to how you carry out a project as enormous and complex as Apollo. Really, we could not have gotten to the moon without those practices. This is some of the stuff I talk about in my course. And then way in the back with the cigar on the right behind George Low is Max Faget, who was one of the chief designers of the spacecraft. So these are just some of the many giants of Apollo. And I'll turn it over to questions, or let me see if there's any more in the chat. Have all the Apollo missions succeeded going to the moon and returning back? Yes, except for Apollo 13, of course, which didn't get to land because they had an explosion aboard the service module, and they had to use the lander as a lifeboat. By the way, there's a lot of luck that figures into that story. There's a great article called 13 Things That Saved Apollo 13 that you ought to look up. It talks about all the pieces of luck that came into play. And one of them was, you know, if that had happened, Jim Lovell was the commander of 13. If that explosion had happened on Apollo 8, which was Jim's first lunar flight, they would not have survived because they didn't have a lunar module. Why is the surface of the Apollo on your spacewalk halfway home slide so rough? Oh, yeah, let me go back to that. What are these little bumps? That is places on the service module where the paint has been blistered by thruster firings. So that's what that is. And Ron Evans was so excited to be doing this spacewalk, and he was describing all this stuff, and he felt like he was getting to be a spaceman, in his element, because he's an engineer and he's a test pilot, and he gets to go outside and report on these details of the vehicle, and he was just having the time of his life. Okay, I think maybe that's the last. Oh, any comments on the lunar communion from Buzz Aldrin on Apollo 11? Well, that was a very interesting little episode. Buzz had felt the magnitude of this event was so awesome, being on the crew of the first lunar landing. He really felt what he told me was, he just wanted to find a way to recognize and kind of grapple with the awesome nature of the event. And that was his way of doing that, by taking communion on the surface. And David, I'm happy to answer any other questions if you want to unmute anybody.
Oh yeah,
who raises their hand.
We could do that. Actually, I can unmute people. We also have in the Q&A section a number. We have 4 or 5 questions. We have 5 questions there. If you can open your Q&A tab at the bottom or top.
Oh yeah, okay.
Whatever appears in your Zoom. There's like 5 questions. Now we got Tim's question at the top.
A lot of these I've already answered. Yeah, all of these I've answered.
You already answered them? Okay, good. Okay, yeah. Well, I go to the chat box. If anyone wants to raise their hand, if anyone wants to raise their hand.
We got about 5 minutes left, I think.
Yeah, I mean, let's see here. Okay, here we go. Let's see here. I'm going to allow Janine Renee to talk here.
Yes, I have a question. Of the different books that you've written, which one speaks to like the mystical experiences that they had just being on the moon? Which of the books do you recommend for that?
Oh, thanks for the question, Janine. I wouldn't call it a mystical experience. I would call it a professional experience, I would say. In fact, that was one of the things that I had to come to terms with when I was writing my book, was that I was expecting it to be a kind of a zap, if you will, something that would just blow every fuse in your head, you know, but they were not that way. They really were there as professionals who were there to do a job that they had been selected to do out of, you know, all the human beings on the planet. They were the ones who got to do it, and they did it for a program that was tremendously important to the country, with the entire world watching on live TV. And so they were really focused on doing a good job, but they also, you know, kind of took stolen moments to take in it was an amazing experience, I'd say that. And for Ed Mitchell, it became a kind of a trigger for an exploration that lasted the rest of his life. I would recommend a book called Voices from the Moon that I did in 2009 with my wife, Victoria Cole, Kohl. So if you go on Amazon and you look for Voices from the Moon, or if you go on my website, andrewchaikin.com /books, that book is in the book section. And the reason I would steer you to that is that I think by reading the quotes from my interviews combined with the, you know, very nice imagery that's in that book, it combines the images with the quotes. I think you'll get a very nice feel for, on an intimate level, with the whole sweep of the experience, including the impact of it. So that's what I would suggest.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Well, I have a question then. Let's see. Okay, yeah. In terms of, say whether there's science fiction or say more inspired by real missions, which movie would you think best explores space travel?
Well,
you can sort of capture the nuances. I mean, there's so many movies that come out every year or so where they talk about going to space, and I wonder how realistic or how right that takes you get it.
Well, I wish I could comment on that from personal experience, right? But I can't. But from everything I know, from having been a space geek all these decades and having done all the conversations that I've done, all the research, I would go back to 2001: A Space Odyssey for capturing the nuances of the way vehicles move in spaceflight,
right? The
lighting, the beauty of the lighting, and the beauty of the vehicles moving, the sound, the no noise, the soundlessness of spaceflight. You know, that really does a great job. In terms of what I understand to be the beauty of the Earth, I would go to Gravity. Even though I was not a fan of the movie from a story level, I thought they did a beautiful job, as far as I can tell, of conveying the beauty of what it's like to be in low Earth orbit. So those two.
Gravity in 2001. Okay, because I saw 2001, that was so many years ago. I might want to rewatch that.
Oh, you want to see it? You want to see it on a good monitor. You want to see a high def transfer on a good monitor.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to do that. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
Sure.
Let's see. I know Ron, Gray, and Tim and Bill. So I don't know. I guess Tim may have their hands up. But let's see. What time is it now? Because it's now 8:30. I mean, we can talk for a few more minutes if you want to, but I mean, we could also end the talk. If anyone has any one or two last comments, I guess we can take one or two more comments in if you want to. I guess Ron, or no? I wasn't sure if you have your hands up. No, I guess not.
I could talk. Thank you very much, Andy. It was a great presentation.
Thank you, Ron. I appreciate it. I'm glad you were here.
And Andrew, I posted, we mentioned 2001. I met Arthur C. Clarke in 1981 at the Unispace conference in Vienna, Austria. And he told me how the name for the computer HAL was derived. So do you know that bit of trivia?
Well, Michael Benson, who's a friend of mine, wrote what I consider to be the definitive book on the movie. And even though, and I highly recommend it, Michael Benson, just look up 2001: A Space Odyssey, Michael Benson. It's a behind the scenes, in depth. I know everybody says he took IBM and shifted it one letter, but I'm not sure if Michael confirms that that was actually in his mind at the time or not. He may have gotten into the habit of saying that later. Is that what you were going to say, Bill?
Yeah. I think that's probably a story he was using in 1981.
Yeah, but Michael tells such a great story. He just really and he knew Arthur and talked to him many times and got access to Kubrick's archives and all kinds of great things. So
yeah, I had lunch with Arthur C. Clarke at that conference, and also got to meet Carl Sagan there too. So it was a pretty neat deal.
That sounds very cool.
Okay, I guess if you want, let me just go ahead and minimize the screen. I guess
I just saw a question, what book would I recommend for 13-year-olds? And I happen to have a copy right here. It's called Mission Control, This is Apollo. And well, this is actually even for younger readers than that, but 13-year-old might enjoy it as well. And it's a book that my wife and I did with Alan Bean with his paintings. And it tells the story of every mission, but it's illustrated with his paintings. So that would be one option. And of course, the other option would be my book, A Man on the Moon, which is written for adults, but an ambitious 13-year-old definitely could read that and understand it. So there's my little commercial.
I missed that last one. What was the title of that one? And the other one, Mission Control, This is Apollo. Is that the one that you,
right?
The previous book?
And then This is A Man on the Moon, which is my
A Man on the Moon. Okay.
My big 600-page tome that I wrote after interviewing the astronauts.
Kind of like your magnum opus, I guess.
My magnum opus, yeah, took me 8 years.
Wow.
Yeah, I got an unrelated question on how to pay your dues. Jack, if you just you probably have me in the newsletter. If you contact me, I can put you in contact with Ronnie about the dues. But I think Ronnie will also be sending out, Ronnie LaJoy will be sending out paperwork about the annual dues. Is that right, Ronnie? If you can hear me, all right, let me see. I don't want to get sidetracked on it too much, but.
Okay, I think I'm going to turn into a pumpkin any minute here.
Okay, that's fine. Well, anyway, just go ahead and just, Jack, if you just contact me, I'll put my chat there. Hold on, I'll just send it here. Anyway, just you can contact me at that Yahoo account, and I'll just get you in touch with Ronnie. But we'll deal with dues later. This is probably one. Okay, so I guess that will be it. So just I would like to. Okay, I guess Andrew. I would like to on behalf of HAL 5, I'd like to thank you again for taking the time to talk to us tonight about your research and about sort of your perspectives on a very unique topic.
Thank you for having me, David. I really enjoyed it. I'm really glad I could do this.
And we actually had 39 attendees tonight.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good turnout. A very good turnout. So yes. Okay, well, I guess with that, everyone, I would like to thank you for your time. And we'll be having our membership meeting sometime inside January, at which point in time we'll be electing, if you want to volunteer for any positions in the HAL 5. As president, I will be stepping down for next year, as I anticipate being, if things work out, I'll be a father later inside a few months. So I'll have some other new obligations coming up about March with a new daughter. So I'll be on diaper changing duty at that time. So, but I'll still be part of HAL 5, and we'll definitely have a meeting. And I guess with that, I'm going to thank you everyone for attending tonight. And we'll be posting this on our YouTube channel as well, if you want to review it. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. And I guess I'll be ending the talk now. Thank you.